Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us to learn about trafficking, incarceration, and survival, how the criminal legal system harms victims. I cannot tell you how grateful I am to see you all here, and honestly, it gives me a sense of relief and a feeling of opportunity. Panelists, there are 140 people here today ready to hear and learn from you and your experiences because they see that we have the power and responsibility to change our systems and to make an impact so that others do not have to go through the same things that you went through. So that moving forward, we all together shift the perspectives and close gaps because really we're not here today just to learn, just to be on a panel, just to be on a webinar. We're here today to make a change for survivors of forced crimes. So that being said, off of my soapbox, I am Charlie Borg. I'm the Senior Program Officer for Framework, an OVC-funded training and technical assistance program. We are dedicated to increasing identification, enhancing services, and improving partnerships. You can connect us with us at frameworkta.org, and there you will find recordings of our past webinars, our past survivor panels, resources so that you can, in your regional trainings, see survivor excerpts and testimonies and do practice videos with your populations, whether or not that's your staff or your partners. We will be recording today's event and we'll distribute it to everybody who's registered. So do not worry about that. We're also going to be using the Q&A feature today. So at any point, if you have a question, just grab the Q&A from the bottom of your menu, type that in, and periodically go through and upvote things that you want to talk about, because like I said, this is going to be a jam-packed event, and we want to know what you feel is most important to hear from our panelists today. So now it is my genuine pleasure to hand it over to our moderator today, James Dold, human rights lawyer, movement strategist, and social entrepreneur. James has been an integral part of passing so many, I think nearly 100 laws focusing on anti-trafficking, juvenile sentencing reform, and eliminating things like juvenile sentences of life without parole across the United States. He is the founder and CEO of Human Rights for Kids and a past Framework advisory panel member. So James, we are so lucky to have you. I'm gonna hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Charlie. And thank you to Framework as well for hosting this really incredible panel discussion. And thank you to all of you who are out there joining us today to learn more about what I believe to be one of the most under talked about and really underreported and under investigated incidents of human trafficking, and that is individuals who are forced into criminal activity. And, you know, for me, this is an area that is very personal because throughout my career, I've worked at the intersection of child protection issues, both for kids who've experienced trafficking and trauma, child sexual abuse, as well as reforming the way that the criminal legal system treats children. And one of the things that becomes very apparent when you work in both of those spaces is that oftentimes they're the same kids that we're talking about, right? The kids who've experienced the most amount of abuse, trauma, adverse childhood experiences in their life are oftentimes the kids who end up in the criminal legal system. And one of the things that we don't do a good job of is really screening to understand what all of the circumstances are that surround their system involvement. And when we really begin to peel back the layers, we begin to understand that there are these broader themes of exploitation that happen. And it's not just children, it's also older adults as well. And so this is a really important conversation to really begin to understand what we're missing in the anti-trafficking context here in the United States. And hopefully people will walk away from this training having a better sense on what to look for in trying to identify trafficking victims who've been forced to commit crimes, and then what we can do to better support survivors as well. This is also a very personal issue for me. I'm also a survivor of child labor trafficking and sexual abuse. I was victimized from the time I was 13 to about 16 years old. And I remember when I first came out as a survivor, one of the things that I really struggled with was sort of putting into context my own traumatic experiences, because it didn't neatly fit within the paradigms of trafficking that we, so oftentimes are taught about, right? Sort of forced fraud or coercion in the context of either sex trafficking or labor trafficking. And I think what we begin to see is that there's a lot of overlap in the anti-trafficking space for survivors who experience both forms of sex trafficking as well as labor trafficking, and then experience other forms of crimes as well. And so my hope that folks will take away from this training as well is to not look so myopically in the anti-trafficking space as something being just labor trafficking or sex trafficking, but also a little bit more broad so that we can identify more and more victims. I'm going to give a brief overview of the issue before we get started, before I introduce our panel, just so we can orient ourselves a little bit in terms of the discussion that we're going to have. I oftentimes like to start these conversations by just giving a little bit of a historical background on why we currently have the anti-trafficking apparatus that we do. And it really stems in part from the US Supreme Court and a decision that they came down with in 1988 called Kosminski. For those that aren't familiar, the Kosminski case was a labor trafficking case that involved two individuals, two brothers who suffered from intellectual disabilities, who had been isolated on a farm and were forced to provide labor for no pay. And they lived in squalid conditions. They were threatened that if they tried to leave, they would be placed in a mental institution. Just really, really horrific forms of exploitation and coercion that were used against them. And in the Kosminski case, the court was really trying to decide, a circuit split that had developed. The DOJ had primarily relied on the involuntary servitude statutes that date back to the 1800s post-Civil War to prosecute a lot of these cases. And what had happened was at the circuit court level, there was a split among the circuits to say, in some cases, DOJ brought that, it was really a sort of a subjective standard. So you looked at all of the circumstances from the victim standpoint to determine whether or not a similarly situated victim in the same situation, the same position as that victim would feel free to leave or not. Or if the standard was a more objective standard where you really had to prove, the use of force or threats of legal process through the objective, reasonable person who, doesn't necessarily share the victim's background, experience, those sorts of things. And so the court in this case really narrowed the scope of the involuntary servitude statute, ruling that, the Department of Justice could only bring cases by looking at, the lens of the objective person, essentially. And so that really is what precipitated the TVPRA. And in 2008, that was amended out to basically overrule the Kosminski decision to give DOJ broader discretion to prosecute cases so that they could show to a jury that all of the surrounding circumstances that a trafficker had created for the victim, would compel any other person of that victim's background and experience to continue performing that labor or services, right? So when we think about labor trafficking, and I know there's service providers who are on now who are very well steeped in this, oftentimes, we use that sort of model, force, fraud, or coercion. We know that that can look like a variety of different things. It could be threats of violence. It could be physical violence itself. It could be, debt bondage. It could be, creating sort of cult-like conditions where systematic brainwashing is used to control victims. It could be, surveillance, forcing people to work long hours. This is all pretty common in the labor trafficking context. And when we start talking about forced criminality, those same factors that we look at in determining whether or not something is a form of trafficking are also applicable, right? And so some common examples that, we'll probably hear about a little later on in the panel discussion, highlight some of these. So, in the context of children or other adults who are in gangs here in the United States, for example, what we oftentimes see in these situations is that there's use of physical violence when an individual refuses to commit a crime, right? So this could be, committing a robbery. It could be shooting at a rival gang member. It could be a whole host of things where if that individual refuses to commit a crime, then the leadership of that gang then uses physical violence as a form of punishment for that individual not committing that offense on behalf of the gang. So again, it fits within the paradigm of when we're thinking about force, fraud, or coercion to compel somebody to commit a crime. And under this context, it's really important to understand that when people are forced to commit crimes, that is a form of labor, right? So when we say labor or services in the human trafficking context, it's not necessarily that those things have to be strictly legal. Those can also be illegal things that the Department of Justice or prosecutors can then use to sort of charge traffickers with forcing somebody to commit a crime, which is a pretty common occurrence for many, many trafficking survivors across the country in both the labor and the sex trafficking context. Another example of force, fraud, or coercion being used to compel someone to commit a crime is, and there's been a number of examples like this, individuals both in the U.S. and also abroad where threats are used, threats of violence or threats of harm against their family to sell drugs or to be a drug mule or to transport drugs, within a state or across state lines. So these are again examples of that those threats of violence that can be used to force somebody to break the law in furtherance of a labor trafficking operation. In the sex trafficking context, where it also crosses in and becomes labor trafficking, right? We see pimps or traffickers, right, force bottoms, right? And folks that aren't familiar with that term, we'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. But a bottom is somebody who, a victim, who a trafficker has typically had in their stable the longest, who is forced to commit crimes alongside their trafficker. So oftentimes the bottom is a young woman, or in some cases a young man, who is required to recruit other victims, transport victims to and from their dates, enforce the rules of the trafficker. And what we see is that bottom can sometimes be prosecuted for having helped to further the trafficking operation. So they're committing an offense of furthering sex trafficking, which again, in this particular context would be forced criminality and would cross into the realm of what we consider labor trafficking. We also see sex trafficking victims being forced by traffickers to help in robbing johns or buyers. And so again, where it crosses into the realm of a crime that's being forced to be committed, we're talking about labor trafficking. So those victims become dual sex and labor trafficking victims. And then we also see, as just another example of the force, fraud, coercion paradigm, individuals who become victims of forced criminality because they may have run away from home and they're part of a traveling sales crew, or they fall in with a group where they are then denied food or shelter or protection unless the victim says that they're going to comply with their trafficker to go out and commit a burglary or commit thefts and to help sort of profit the trafficking enterprise. And so there's been a lot of different examples of this over the years. There's been cases where children have been coerced to commit burglaries, and they're beaten or they're threatened if they don't meet their quota of items that they have to come back with, right? There's been instances of, as I mentioned, drug mules and individuals who've been forced to carry drugs. Also people working on drug farms as well as another form of potential forced criminality, particularly where you have those elements present of force, fraud, or coercion being used to compel somebody into a situation of forced criminality. And this is all part of a broader evolution of our understanding of what human trafficking is. And, in the broader movement, we're still very much in some ways in the infancy of understanding all of the different complexities of what human trafficking is. When the TVPA was first enacted by Congress, there was a feeling by many that, there weren't US citizen victims. both in the labor trafficking as well as in the sex trafficking context. And of course, over the years, as advocates came along and actually began to show how, the paradigm of forced fraud or coercion was being used against U.S. citizens to compel them into human trafficking situations, law enforcement and the broader anti-trafficking apparatus evolved to recognize that U.S. citizens, yes, in fact, can be victims of trafficking. And this, company has primarily played out in the sex trafficking context, but I think we're also starting to see a broader awakening now in the labor trafficking context, particularly around individuals who are very vulnerable, who are forced to commit crimes. Now, this is something that in the sex trafficking context as well, advocates have been dealing with for quite a bit of time because, in the sex trafficking context, while there's so much focus on the forced commercial sexual exploitation, there's also a number of other criminal acts that many survivors are forced to commit. Those include things like drug possessions, weapon possessions, trespassing, loitering, all the things that I mentioned before, as well as robbing Johns and the like, right? And so all of those are examples of how, in the sex trafficking context, advocates have really sort of had to sort of try to figure out how to protect those victims from a justice system that, by all accounts, very much sees everything it comes into contact with as sort of a nail, and the justice system being a hammer. So it hasn't really developed the flexibility to handle those cases in the way that they really should be handled, which is treating those survivors as victims of labor trafficking and through the use of forced criminality. And this is particularly acute when we begin to look at children in gangs as well. Again, everybody here knows what the elements of labor trafficking are, and when we really begin to peel back the layers of so many children who are exploited by gangs, what we begin to see is that the children who are in gangs in the United States actually make up the minority of gang members. They're roughly only about a third of the entire gang population in a given gang and across the United States. But the methods and patterns of control are very similar to what we see in other trafficking contexts. And like I mentioned earlier, the use of physical force and violence and threats if a child does not agree to go along with a particular crime. And so, again, when we look at the subjective standard that was created by the TVPA and looking at the situation from a victim in the shoes of that particular person, right, given all of the different contexts, right, whether they're from another country, their age, whether or not, if there's this power dynamic, if you have a very young child, say like an 11 or 12-year-old, and they have a 25-year-old gang leader, right, the power dynamics that exist in those situations, the ability of somebody to really have agency and feel like they can leave a situation if they know that the consequences of leaving that gang are, physical violence, harm, potentially death to them or their family members, right? And so what we end up seeing is these patterns that emerge that very much mimic what we see in other contexts of human trafficking as well. But we haven't quite put all of that together to understand that, the people that we're oftentimes looking at and sometimes demonizing, right, as common criminals, are actually victims of human trafficking, that they're being forced to commit these crimes, and that they're under the control of a third-party trafficker, right? And there's a lot of literature out there, and we won't talk too much about this, but there's a lot of literature out there that actually draws a lot of strong parallels between children in the United States who have been exploited by gangs and have been forced to commit crimes, and what children in other countries have experienced with the use of child soldiering, right? And so the parallels are spot on in terms of what we see with the vulnerabilities of children that lead them to join an armed militia group or join, in the US context, a criminal gang, in terms of the methods of control, the violence that is used, and how oftentimes youth in both contexts feel like in that moment, they are actually making a conscious decision and choice to be a part of that armed militia group or being a part of that gang, right? Because there's a sense of safety, protection, and love that comes in those institutions that they're not getting in their home or community environments, right? But then once they're trapped in those institutions or in those gangs, right, then they, don't have the ability to exit, or they don't have the ability to say no, not to commit a particular type of crime. And so sometimes what we see is people, getting involved in gangs for reasons that, you know, are very common to the human experience, like everything that I just mentioned, that sense of belonging, wanting to, you know, have some sort of protection, maybe, you know, being so impoverished that, you know, the gang is the only source of place where they can have a roof over their head or have food, right? And then all of a sudden the script is flipped, and, you know, they're in a situation where they have to do things that they don't want to do, right? But they can't say no because the consequences of that are physical violence, pain, sometimes death. And so it's really important to understand the similarities, because in the context of child soldiers, this is universally recognized, of course, as being a form of human trafficking, right? There's an optional protocol under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Internationally, these children are looked at as victims. But in the US context, when we look at the very exact same dynamics that play out, we don't look at those children as victims. And so this is a really important thing for us to understand and discuss and talk about if we're going to be effective at identifying the true scope of people in the United States who are victims of forced criminality and therefore victims of labor trafficking. One quick quote before I introduce our really amazing panel. In the materials that are going to be sent out as a follow-up, there's a really powerful one-pager by the US State Department. And I think this does a really great job of highlighting the fact that, you know, forced criminality is one of the most underrepresented and under-talked about areas of human trafficking that we need to do a better job of as a broader community. In a 2014 one-pager, the US Department says that one distinct yet often under-identified characteristic of human trafficking is forced criminality. Traffickers may force adults and children to commit crimes in the course of their victimization, including theft, illicit drug production and transport, prostitution, terrorism, and murder. For example, in Mexico, organized criminal groups have forced children and migrants to work as assassins and in the production, transportation, and sale of drugs. Victims of trafficking should not be held liable for their involvement in unlawful activities that are a direct consequence of their victimization. Let me say that one more time. Victims of trafficking should not be held liable for their involvement in unlawful activities that are a direct consequence of their victimization. Trafficked individuals who are forced to commit a crime are commonly mistaken for criminals, rather than being identified as victims, and therefore treated as such by law enforcement and judicial officials. That is the United States Department of State. So that obviously begs the question, which is why we are here. Why do we still treat labor trafficking victims who are forced to commit crimes as criminals then? And with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask for our panelists to go ahead and join us on screen if they haven't already. I'm really excited for this conversation. You guys are in for a treat. I think it's an area, like I said, that isn't talked about nearly as much as it should be. I'm very excited to have everyone here with us. And so why don't we go ahead and get started? And I'm just going to go ahead and ask each of our panelists, and I'll call on you in the order that I see you on my screen. If you can tell us a little bit about yourself and your experiences working in the space of forced criminality and labor trafficking. And Xavier, you're first on my screen, so I'm going to start with you first.
Thank you, and thanks to all of you who are here in attendance. And let me first start who I am today. Obviously, I'm Xavier McElrath-Bey. I am a co-executive director at the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, and I've had the great privilege of working alongside James for many years. And you know, I would say that my experience is more direct, and as someone who has been in the system, someone who as young as 13 years old was charged with first-degree murder, and I often think back, especially after having conversations with James and making the connection between my experience and that of sex trafficked victims. I often ask myself, what if the judge knew the truth? What if the judge really knew the truth? I was charged with first-degree murder at age 13, but I didn't lay a finger on my victim. On the day that it happened, I remember all the emotions that I had, the emotions of not wanting to be there any longer, the emotions of fear that if I said something, there would be a consequence as being a part of a gang, the fear of what could be happening to the victim in that abandoned building, and the sadness that I felt and what I saw on the faces of others who were there with me on that porch, as we heard the sound of someone's life being taken away. And I just want to say that, you know, I know I was not a monster. I was not someone who wanted to happen what happened. And for me, at that young age, I didn't feel like I had a choice on whether to be there. I certainly didn't have a choice on whether to leave the gang that I had became a part of just a couple years earlier. I do in some ways recognize that, and now as an adult especially, that I was a victim of many circumstances, and in particular of a gang that didn't always have my best interests. And for me, you know, now just really just trying to grapple with that reality, coupled with the fact that everything else in the world convinced me that I was a bad person. Everything else in the world convinced me that, you know, because I was part of this gang, that I was just as guilty. You know, and then every entity, in particular every adult in my life, being a source of abuse and neglect, whether it was my, you know, foster mother, whether it was my group home manager, whether it was, you know, my stepfather, teachers, police officers. I can go on and on about the many instances in adults in my life that really convinced me that because I was a part of this gang, that I was a bad person. And those who were inside the gang really convincing me that this is who I was supposed to be. And if I didn't adhere to these things, I would be met with swift consequence. And looking back as an adult, I do realize that in so many ways, I was oblivious to my own conditioning. I was oblivious to the fact that I wasn't making my own decisions. I really wasn't. I knew I was afraid. I was scared. I was a kid who didn't want to be there oftentimes, but was also running from other traumas in my life. You know, that being an abusive home, that being an environment in my home that was very toxic and not nurturing, and convincing myself that this was the greatest social institution within my reach, that the gang, the love that I felt there, and the genuine relationships that I had with my friends who were also part of the gang. Like, you know, it was, looking back upon my past actions, it was hard to convince myself that I was a victim. But I'll share more in a little while of an experience that really just solidified that for me, and why it's important we begin to do that systemically. So thank you.
Thank you, Xavier. It's a great way to get us started. Very powerful. Carolina, you're next on my screen.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Xavier. My name is Carolina de los Rios. I have spent the past 14 years working with survivors of trauma, which include survivors of human trafficking, survivors of violence. I had worked for a long time with youth, gang-involved youth. So thank you, Xavier, for your story and for sharing. Just basically very grateful to be in this space. I'm very grateful, James, for bringing this up as such an important topic. In my years of working with gang-involved youth, I know in my heart that all of them were victims of force and coercion, and unfortunately, that's not the perception of society. And I am so grateful for this space. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. Autumn?
Hi, my name is Autumn Smith Amy, and I currently reside in Alaska. I own Alaska Relative and Kinship Providers and Amy Consulting, which are grassroots community-driven responses to assisting marginalized community members, both urban and rural, and we provide resources, referrals, crisis case management, support groups, and community outreach. And sometimes we just bear witness to or intervene in systemic injustices. We currently advocate for 300 clients in 22 tribes, and we provide TA assistance in child welfare reformation and commercial sex trafficking to 5 separate agencies.
Great, thank you, Autumn. And Shamere?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shamere McKenzie, and I wear several hats. I am the anti-trafficking ambassador to Jamaica, the CEO of the Sungate Foundation, and the training manager for the National Human Trafficking Hotline that's operated by Polaris. I have had several interactions with the legal system on a personal level and have worked with survivors who continuously have interactions with the legal system. And the unfair treatment, and as Xavier was saying earlier, how our system that is in place to protect individuals really don't see these individuals as victims, but rather as criminals. And that's the conversation that I'm excited to be amongst these elite panelists today to really have, and hopefully we can change the direction of how how the legal system is really responding to human beings who are being forced at the expense of someone else, right? To respond to these type of things. So I'm really excited. Thank you for this opportunity.
Great, thank you, Shamere. And I'm actually going to pick up on the point that you just raised, and this will be my first question for the panelists. And I like everyone's thoughts on this, and feel free to weigh in. But why is it that service providers and law enforcement, we have a lot of service providers who are joining this webinar today, have such a hard time recognizing that forced criminality is a common experience among victims of human trafficking? And what can they do, if you have recommendations, to better be able to identify survivors who have been forced to commit crimes?
I can start. I think when we're talking about trafficking, right, and it is a very complex issue, right? And I think at times various groups don't really understand the complexity. They hold to the piece of the issue that they know and they understand, and they work towards that piece, right? And I also want to say that I know we have some amazing service providers and some amazing law enforcement that actually get it, that actually get individuals who are being forced to commit crimes. So I really want to say that we're not just putting all victim service providers and all law enforcement in a bucket. But what I think that is happening is that people hold on to the piece that they know and work that piece. And oftentimes they don't try to explore the other complex part of this issue, right? So we know that this is multifaceted, it's very complex. And especially when we're talking about law enforcement who for most of them, this is new. How do we work trafficking cases, right? How do we bring this to a prosecutor to say, yes, let's take this to court, right? How do they comprehend what they see before them? And if they have been taught a certain way to view this issue, to view people, to see things in the black and white and not think outside of the box, we're going to continue to see the problems that exist. We're going to continue to see individuals who are victims being criminalized as a direct result of their victimization if we don't continue to implement training, specialized training around this particular piece, right? Around forced criminality, right? Because we could talk about trafficking and people are going to interpret, oh, trafficking is this, right? And they're going to walk away and hold on to that piece. But we need to have more in-depth conversations like we're having today to talk about what does it look like when you're being forced by a trafficker and have consequences? Because we understand commercial sex and forced labor, right? We everybody that I think work on this issue understand that piece. Oh, they're being forced to engage in commercial sex. They're being forced to, there's forced labor occurring. But what is hard for the masses to understand is that there are other crimes that the traffickers force victims to commit, and their consequences. Similarly, so if you don't engage in commercial sex, if you don't engage in forced labor, there are consequences. And those consequences are severe. When I say consequences, when I talk, I like to tell people, when you think of torture, whatever comes to your mind when you think torture happens as a consequence, because these traffickers are letting you know, don't play with me. If you don't carry this out, it's you, it's your family, or however I can teach you a lesson and make you as an example to others so that you are doing what I tell you to do. And there's no benefit for the individual, right? So when you're being forced, there's no benefit for you to say, hey, I'm going to do this because the trafficker say, and I'm going to get $1 million if I do this. There's no benefit. The only person that's benefited is the true perpetrator, which oftentimes walk away.
You said something very powerful there, Shamere, the true predator who oftentimes walks away. And, even when it comes to engagement with the justice system, it was very interesting. There was one thing that my older co-defendant who had navigated the system, who was obviously more mature and was more savvy in that respect, he knew a number of things that would get him off. He knew, A, not to confess. He knew also that we would be petrified at the thought of testifying against him. All of us who were young, who were, to be quite honest with you, brutalized and forced into a confession, we were the ones who were found guilty or pled guilty. He withstood that beating at the homicide unit. He knew that if he made it through that beating of those homicide detectives, that he would be free someday. He beat that case, and interestingly, ended up getting convicted years later of another homicide. He's now serving an 80-year sentence in prison. But the reality is that oftentimes, and we see this in the space of juvenile life without parole, that there are oftentimes older co-defendants that play a more dominant role, but because they know the system, they know how to navigate the system, and you find the children getting life without parole and all these extreme outcomes. And I also want to point to something that, to answer a question that you helped raise there, Shamere, and that is that, why are we unable to see this particular population as victims? And I will go as far as to say that there's this presumption of guilt and dangerousness that comes with gangs. Because when we think about gangs, we think predominantly of Black, brown, indigenous people of color, right? And that is something we need to embrace as well in this conversation. And so for me, thinking about, the challenges of the system actors not hammering away, but being more compassionate, I think it taps into the deeper sensibility of what are our biases? What are our systemic challenges that stand in the way of that? And B, what are the ways in which we can become more proximate to get to hear from these youth, to talk to them, to really understand the intimate realities that they face, the heart-wrenching and scary decisions they have to make each and every day. And I think we'll have a better sense of what real support could look like.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, Xavier, you mentioned something really powerful, same as Shamere, in terms of we got to expand our view of one. So it's like from a clinical perspective, we have to expand our view of what trauma is. And I think, James, you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that there is plenty of research internationally about child soldiers and what that the impact of trauma is, and all the dynamics that are very much mimicking the trafficking dynamics. And there is very little research, although there is more now, in terms of how that is equally similarly to the gang dynamics. However, not only expanding the trauma perspective in terms of the clinical view, but also taking into consideration those interlocking systems of oppression, the systemic racism, how is that basically we ended up with, from my experience, obviously I'm talking about like me as a service provider, like the youth that I work with, the majority were Black youth and Latinx youth. That's it. And that is basically pretty much what we have to work with. And as an advocate of color, I have to deal with those interlocking systems of oppression and discrimination as well. So what that really means and what is really we're facing here, what do we need to do really from changing that perspective, that basically there is a recognition internationally that child soldiers basically go through the same patterns of trauma as gang-involved youth, all the dynamics are there, and there are plenty of research out there. I can share later on in the link of a lot of research that I found that basically talk about child soldiers and gang-involved youth in the US and have similarities. But I think it is important. I think Shamere and Xavier, you just mentioned it. I think it's important to mention we are facing here systemic racism. We're facing here interlocking variables of oppression that create those conditions that make the traffickers and the gang leaders to be very much like in charge. We are creating as a society those possibilities for the youth to have little control. Brown bodies, Black bodies, like BIPOC communities, we do have that vulnerability already. So what are we doing for our youth? What are we doing here that we're not protecting them? And basically there comes the trafficker, there comes the gang leader, and they're easy like then to get and recruit these youth. So I think we need to name it as a providers, as an institutions of law enforcement. I think we need to look at it and we need to name it. And as an advocates of colors, we actually need to recognize that we also have to fight harder to be heard. Otherwise, basically, we're reproducing that. So I just feel that we need to expand our view in all directions, not only from the clinical perspective, but also from the perspective as a society and the oppression and the marginalization that day to day our youth in this, if we're thinking about gang-involved youth, they have to face the challenge and have little control.
Thank you, Carolina. Autumn, I saw you were off mute. Did you want to add anything here?
Yeah, the issue to me is consent and intent. The dynamics are so complex. And in my experience, I wasn't freely giving my consent to be in that situation. I couldn't revoke or deny participation without risk of great harm. And I wasn't informed of any other choice because I was isolated and heavily monitored. So I wasn't an enthusiastic participant. I was definitely operating under fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and I knew to my core that I was wholly unsafe. So to intend to do something is synonymous with consent. And without consent, there is no intent. And I think it's the compartmentalization of those two terms that challenges the legal system and law enforcement.
James, you know, I want to add a veteran survivor leader, Vanita Carter. Whenever she talks, she shares this story about being arrested as a woman, as a child of color, alongside a white girl. And she always shares about how the officer would arrested her and told the white girl to go because she stand a chance. Now let that just sink in for a minute. Vanita Carter, a woman of color, as a child, being arrested for prostitution. And the officer allowed the white girl to walk freely and arrested her and told the white girl she stand a chance. And so when Carolina touched on racism, we can't talk about this issue without understanding that intersectionality is at the core, and we can't talk about trafficking and ignore racism. Because some of our laws that are still on the books, we see racism very present, like the Mann Act, AKA the White Slavery Act, right? So I think it needs to start with the change in the mindset of our culture, the change in undoing, well, we can't undo the past, but changing the direction in which we're going and call out things for what they are, what they truly are, right? Versus like covering it up and sweetening up. No, we're not going to talk about racism because there's a white person in the room that may be offended. Well, if you're offended, then you need to rise up and do something. And that's why we continue to have these problems. I think I'm talking too much. Back to you, James.
No, you're good. You're good. I would encourage anybody, anytime you have something to add, just feel free to chime in. But you know what each of you talked about, though, you know, does bring up another question, right? And I think what a lot of folks might be wondering, as this is a new area that they might be sort of hearing about for the first time, and you know, I think that and this might be sort of a common answer for a lot of trafficking victims, but I wonder if you all can talk a little bit, just based on your own experiences and the work that you've done with survivors, what is it that makes people vulnerable to becoming victims of forced criminality through labor trafficking? And how do traffickers identify or recruit victims that they feel that they can manipulate or coerce into committing crimes? And if you can talk a little bit about that and what your experiences are like, and that'd be great.
Yeah. Was someone else gonna jump in? I'm sorry, I don't want to. Okay, well, so I just want to like really restate something I mentioned earlier. And that is that I was oblivious to the fact that much of what I was experiencing was a form of victimization. Much of what you said earlier today, James, that much of my actions were based upon the most basic and fundamental human needs. And those were the needs for love, a sense of belonging, purpose, and naturally found that amongst my friends, but found this very colorful entity. And what was really, I felt initially, especially, was a wellspring of support. What I felt initially was a source of protection in a very violent community, was a source of protection from a very abusive stepfather who hesitated at nothing and beating us, hitting my mom, and kicking our dog. Was a source of protection from all that I felt was threatening, because I felt that sense of belonging and safety there. And so for me, being unaware of how, in so many ways, while I was seeking the emotional rewards and feeling those emotional deficits in my life, while I was going through the day-to-day of those experiences and not being aware of how, having the inclination or the sensations of fear, or even just a feeling as though like, I don't want to do that, but not really having a choice. I thought that came with it. I thought they came with, I thought I was, in some ways, like, this was a part of it, and interestingly for me as a child, like I think back on instances. I remember the first time one of the older guys had handed me a gun, and I had never held a real gun before. I remember him putting it in my hand, and I didn't even know what to do with it. And I did what I saw on television. I put it in my waistband, but I remember like instantly, like, I was like, what if I shoot my, like I was scared, and I was like, I felt almost frozen, but I couldn't say no because I knew that would be met with consequence. I remember going fast forward to the last day of my gang membership. I was in Pontiac Correctional Center while serving time for that murder, and I had just turned 18 years old. I was in solitary confinement for a year because, again, feeling pressure to be participatory in a riot that had happened that involved my gang and a rival gang and officers. And I was in that hole for a year. And I remember thinking, I don't want to live this way anymore. I don't want to die here, in prison. I was in one of the worst prisons in the state. I remember, death row would always come to my mind because it was just like 300 feet away from me. We were in a sub block over. And I remember coming to the decision of saying, I'm going to die being a part of this life, or I'm going to die trying to escape it. And I just thought, at least I can give myself a shot at life. And I remember I wrote a long letter to my gang peers and Alden population. And I didn't even know who the letter was going to. I just knew it was going to leadership of the gang. And I remember stating in that letter that I love y'all, but I can't do this anymore. I came into prison as a child, but now I'm a man. At 18 years old, I thought I was a man. But I knew I just wanted to escape that life. And though I had 8 more years to go in prison, I just couldn't see myself going down the trajectory that I was on. And I remember a week before I left out of the hole and was going to be going back to population, I was so afraid. I had sleepless nights. I was anxious. I lost weight. I couldn't keep myself together. I was staying up. I was staying up at night and sleeping during the day, and everything was just like my body, my soul. I was terrified because I knew that when I came out the hole and went to population, that I was gonna have to stand in front of these individuals. I was gonna have to let them know and restate what I said in that letter, that I didn't want to be a part of the gang any longer. And I remember grabbing my photo album. It had thick cover on both sides, and I remember tearing the lining out of it and removing all the inner sheets and stacking on top, the front and back on top of each other. I put 4 holes on the photo album covers, and I put a long string from the top to the bottom. I had tore the thick lining of my sheet to create this string. I had put 2 additional strings at the bottom, and I had looped that string behind my neck, and I tied the other 2 strings behind my back. And it's strange, like I remember I memorized Bible verses. I remember, no weapon that is formed against thee shall prosper, and every tongue that shall rise up against you in judgment shall be condemned. I was memorizing these Bible verses because I knew it was a spiritual battle, that this was something that I felt not only was a physical threat to me, but in so many ways, I just needed something, someone, if not this breastplate, to protect my vital organs. You know, God, please help me, because I'm going to do this. And I remember stepping out into the West House. When I got to the West House, the guard at the bottom said, "What gang are you in?" And I told him the gang that I was a part of. He whistled up to the top gallery. One of the older guys looked down. He came running down the gallery and basically showed me where my cell was at. This officer had handed me over to my gang. You know, this is 1997. No, 1996. And the officer, not knowing that I don't want to be a part of the gang, literally handed me over to my gang. And they showed me where my cell was at. And while I was there in my cell waiting for yard to run, because I was told not to unpack, just wait. And this is my gang telling me, you know, don't unpack your stuff, just wait. We're gonna run yard. And so when they ran yard, we made it to the West House yard. And I remember them walking me to the far side of the yard, away from the gun tower. And I remember them creating a circle around me. And I remember it was cold, it was November. And thankfully, because I was able to hide my breastplate, my torn up, photo album. And I remember thinking to myself that if they're gonna stab me, they're gonna do it now. And I had seen it time and time again with other people who try to leave the gang. And while standing in that circle, petrified, scared, I remember some of the members were saying disrespectful things, and man, you're a B word, and man, like there was, you're scared, blah, 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 like saying all these things. And I remember it was one individual who's standing there mostly quiet through that experience, walking over to me and putting his arm around my neck and telling everyone to disperse. And I remember walking with him in that yard and me watching his right hand, because I thought to myself, if he's gonna stab me, he's gonna stab me with his right hand. Like, I was so hyper vigilant about everything that was happening around me. And I didn't even make eye contact with him. I just kept staring at his right hand. And I was afraid because his arm was right here, and here it is, my chest plate's right here. Like, if he feels that, I'm gonna become, I'm gonna out my, my protection there. And I remember him saying in so many words, and then more concretely, he said, I'm gonna tell you to do 3 things. And I said, what's that? He said, number 1, take your ass to school and educate yourself. Number 2, do not represent this gang ever again. And number 3, don't get caught up in no nonsense from other gangs, because we don't have to come and save you. And it was almost as if, and it was hard for me to really interpret his words initially, but I got the sense that what he was telling me is I had a green light to live my life. And he said something to me that really moved me and brought me to tears. And he said, man, I wish that when I was your age, that I made the same decision that you're making. And his name was Mo. Mo had been in prison already for more than 20 years. And so while we're talking about forced criminality, there are people who are victims, who are lifelong victims, who are in prison today, who cannot escape the consequences despite their change. No matter how much they've changed inside, they have to live through those consequences. And I just want to say that for me, when I think about this issue and how, despite the poor decisions we made, there is a capacity for change for every single person in that gang. And I want to make that clear. I'm not speaking with the intent of criminalizing people. I'm speaking with the recognition that those traumas that sent me to the streets are the same traumas that sent them to the streets, right? They were not bad people. They were just like me. They were broken people. They were broken. And what are we doing with broken people in our society? And so I just want to challenge us to think about it more deeply.
Really powerful, Xavier. Thank you for sharing.
I just want to highlight, thank you, Xavier, the last part that you mentioned, and I think believing in the power of resilience and how that resilience is present in a lot of the youth and a lot of survivors, and how we as providers, or helpers, or advocates can help unpack that source of resilience. And also, just to add something on to your question, James, I think part of the responsibility that we have as a society, as helping professionals, as advocates, is to really make sure that we are doing assessments that are free of biases. And we go back to the same point, but it's impossible again not to talk about this without like mentioning the bias. If I am a clinician and I'm going to be making an assessment of someone that is experiencing PTSD or whatever, and I have certain biases that basically make me already think that because that particular youth in front of me maybe looks like a Latino youth, that maybe is undocumented, and maybe I shouldn't be diagnosing because maybe it's better if that person is no longer around and might be deported. So I think we should just, as providers in whatever role and capacity we are right now in this space of virtual, whatever responsibility we feel we have, we need to be aware of our own biases. We need to be aware of really where are we coming from in this arena, and how we are going to help from those lenses. So if we are willing to help from the lenses of being free of biases, then we gotta work on community healing. We wanna work on that decolonizing approach to the work. And that means really being open to really see those, what you were describing, Xavier, gang-involved youth might be in that spectrum of like victim, perpetrator, and then the cycle reproduces, but what is happening in between, right? What is happening there? What was the impact of that trauma? What is the impact of the moral injury? So there are a lot of things here that we need to unpack. The concept of moral injury is really present in youth that have been involved in gangs, that had to be like in the place of the perpetrator and the victim and all the way around, and then the cycle and the cycle. What are we doing with that? Coming from a perspective of racial healing, coming from a perspective of non-bias, coming from a perspective of decolonizing the work that we're doing. So I think to me, to your point, James, is what can we do to help identify and to name things as they are? Basically start with your own awareness. As a helper, as whoever you are, be aware on how you're coming from, where are you coming from to this work?
Thank you, Carolina. Autumn or Shamere? You guys good?
Yeah, I'll start. I just think there are many vulnerabilities that are risk factors, such as anywhere from incapacitation from substance misuse or mental duress to lack of basic needs being met. We see a lot of historical and lateral trauma, especially in our marginalized tribal communities here, and a lot of damage in nuclear families, such as divorce, abandonment, child abuse, neglect, or domestic violence. And I think these vulnerabilities put folks at high risk of being accosted by traffickers, but I believe it's people's strengths that are used against them by perpetrators to manipulate the control necessary for the criminality aspect.
That's a great point. And Shamere, did you have anything else to add?
Caroline stole my answer, but I think we should really realize that when we talk about vulnerability, traffickers use anything, and it's specific and unique to that person, right? So anything that they feel is a hook that can create fear for that person to say, okay, if if you don't do this, this is going to happen. Or if you don't do that, that's going to happen. And when we talk about people, when we talk about children, and understanding that when we're talking too about forced criminality, it's not just happening to children, but it's happening to adults as well, right? But when you understand a brain, right, a trauma brain. So even when we're talking about an adult, right, that has endured trauma from a child, from they were a child and hasn't unpacked that trauma, and that trafficker comes in and now they're doing, or they're trying to force that individual into doing what they want them to do, understand that even though that is an adult on paper, by birth certificate, okay, they were born, they're an adult, that doesn't necessarily mean they have the mental capacity of an adult. So these are things that we have to look beyond, because I feel like in the movement, sometimes 18 is a magical number. And we are like, oh, that was an adult. They know right from wrong. They know better. They should know better. But really, do these individuals really know better?
It's such a great point, Shamere. And I think everyone really touched on, I think, the intersectionality, right? And Xavier, in your initial comments, you talked about how, for some of the other folks who are involved in the gang who are adults, right? Like they've been victims their entire lives. And, it's not just that we see them, through the singular lens of being an offender, but also validate their experiences of victimization as well. And I think that's a common theme with forced criminality as well, is where you see people go through these different places of being a victim and then committing a crime, right? And back and forth it goes sometimes. And that's also related to, I think, Xavier, what you're talking about, Shamere, what you're talking about, and Autumn, what you were mentioning as well, in this concept of traumatic bonding. There's actually somebody, I'm trying to monitor the chat box as much as I can, and an anonymous commentator actually wanted to talk about this, and it was one of the questions that I had for you all as well. So I wanted to go back to this. Xavier, you mentioned the letter that you sent to the other members of your gang when you were in solitary confinement, talking about how you love them, right? And so my question, for you guys, and maybe this will help service providers understand these dynamics a little bit better as well. Can you talk about sort of the power dynamics between victims and traffickers, and how do victims end up feeling like they have no other choice but to commit a criminal offense? And Autumn, you talked a lot about this, sort of the idea of consent and intent, right? And really zeroing in on personal agency, but connected to that is this idea of traumatic bonding as well. And so can you talk a little bit about sort of the intersection of all of those issues, sort of, how victims feel compelled to go along with committing a crime, and then the role that traumatic bonding also plays in this sense of love and misplaced loyalty that folks sometimes feel to the people that they're surrounded with?
Yeah, in my experience, there's a duality. So my trauma bond to other victims kept me in for fear of not wanting to leave like anyone behind. And then my emotional attachment to my perpetrator resulted in ongoing setbacks. So I just want to clarify that it's no less a daily struggle now than it was 26 years ago. So I still have to address like overcoming trauma bonds and guilt and shame, and if I could have done more in certain situations, or if I could have done less. That's like a daily basis, like reckoning. So it didn't end just because I happened to not be currently victimized.
It's funny when that's a great question. First of all, James, and talk about the trauma bond. And I never forget when I was in Pontiac, when they gave me the green light, I didn't know what to do with myself. To be honest with you, I had no sense of identity. Like everything that I came to believe about myself and being a part of this gang, it had defined me. Everything from my favorite colors to the people I associated myself with. Like I was so indoctrinated into this way of life that when I finally found myself there, bare, standing at the bottom of the gallery, looking up, and then having to decide, well, what do I do now with my life? I didn't. It was like a psychological castration. I found myself, even though when they would run the child line, I was still walking with them, and I was like, wait, okay, just stop, wait, Xavier, let them go. And I felt alone at times, you know. I remember when I would go to the yard, I had to pick up some new habits, and I started running. That was part of it. And I was like, I can't be stationary, because if I associate, I'm going to naturally go to them. And I was fighting myself against that, not because I thought they were bad or evil, but because I need to change my behavior and my thinking and my associations. And you know, joining a boxing team. Interestingly, I joined a boxing team, and I had a new peer group, and now I was seeking rewards from them now, right? Like every human being, like you seek that reward and validation, acceptance, belonging. Well, I knew I had a positive gang now, right? Like some of us, that positive gang is family. For some of us, that positive gang is our coworkers. Or for some of us, you know, like I think it's a natural human instinct to want to be a part of something, to feel belonging. And sadly, when those options are limited, the gang becomes that for many of our youth. And you know, I think that the bonding has to be overcome for the sake of survival in a space like that, right? Like I knew that if I kept associating myself, then the rival gang members are going to still think I'm a member, but I also don't want to signal that I'm not, right? Because that's the survival way of surviving. I don't want them to think that I'm open game, you know. And then I'm also thinking like, I don't, you know, I have to survive. It's just that simple. And so I think the traumatic bonding also because you do have genuine care for people, right? Like that happens. But it's like anything else that's negative in your life, you have to disassociate yourself. And I think, and I hate to speak about this in non-trafficking terms, right? But I'm gonna keep it real with you. I'm gonna be honest with my experience. And for me, I'm still absorbing much of this. And I just have to say that, you know, if we want to help people overcome that, we need to provide something different. We need to give an alternative, right? We need to reinforce positive behavior. We need to extend unconditional positive regard. We have to make them feel worthy, and all of these beautiful, important things that make us human. But yes, when that's missing, it's hard to step away from that. I mean, it's literally extremely hard to step away from the only thing that gives you love. And it's just that simple.
Very well said. And Carolina, Shamere, I don't know if you have anything else to add. It's hard to follow Xavier, right? Like anytime.
Yes. He is speaking that truth, and I love everything that he is saying, and I second everything that our fellow panelists are saying.
Me too. Nothing else to say after Xavier.
Okay, and then I have one last question, and I'm going to turn it over to Charlie. I know people are like dying to get at their questions, and so I want to make sure we have plenty of time for you all to field a question from the panelists. One last question that I want to ask you all is, you know, what recommendations would you have to all of the service providers and folks who've turned in to better identify victims who've been forced to commit crimes? And who at first blush, you know, might not be easily identifiable, right? Because, you know, they're seen through this lens of being a criminal, but actually, you know, have a third party controller, a trafficker, or somebody who's exploiting them. What sorts of advice would you have for them to be better at their job so that they can better identify folks or serve them as well in terms of service provision?
I think I want to piggyback off of something Xavier said earlier. And he said that he had to make a decision within himself to survive, right? And so that is one aspect of trying to overcome. But when you have a trauma bond with a trafficker or with a gang, or if you have a trauma bond, it's not that easy to just say, and when Xavier spoke, right, I'm sure it wasn't just easy for him to make that decision. He said days he found himself following them, right? But that support that is needed to overcome is critical. And if you're not seeing this person beyond their experience and seeing them in a positive light, seeing hope for them. I used to run a facility, and I remember having the staff saying, I don't see no hope for these kids. And I was like, can I fire her now or later? Right? Because if you're not seeing that person, hope for this person, if you're not seeing a future for this person where you can walk alongside that person and be supportive, that's what that person needs. You don't just overcome trauma bonds overnight. It doesn't work like that. It takes time. It takes being intentional, and it takes a loving environment of support. So service providers, what I would say is that change your mindset, change the way you do services. See these people as human beings, see a future, see hope for these individuals, right? And listen, I hear you, but the grant says this. Well, if we're not informing the people who are given the grant that we have to change the way we do services, we're going to continue getting money for doing the wrong things. So who's going to stand up? Who is going to say to OVC? Who's going to say to DOJ, listen, I know you're giving us money for this, but we need to change the way we do things to truly serve so we can have effective change, or else we're just going to continue this cycle. A cycle with broken people, a cycle of people who have the potential to be re-trafficked, a cycle with traffickers know, hey, they're over there and they think they're addressing anti-trafficking efforts, but sooner or later, they're gonna come back to us because it ain't working. So if we really wanna put a dent into this, let's change the way we do things. Let's look at our old habits and say, is it really working? Are we leaving out a set of individuals? Right? Because we have the perfect victim that we look at and say, yes, this person deserves help. This person fits the mold of what a victim looks like. But what happens to the person who doesn't fit the mold? What happens to the person who is not what the media portrays to be the perfect victim? What happens to the person who is still defending the person who forced them to commit crimes because of that trauma bond? Like when your brain is impacted by trauma, you don't get to say, hey, this is how I'm going to respond. Hey, I want to respond this way. You respond. It's a natural response. I don't get to choose that. I just know my behavior change. Sometimes I like it. Sometimes I don't. And if I look in the mirror and I don't like what I see, I may try to change it. And some days I may be like, forget this. Why? Why move on when I'm faced with all these roadblocks in society? We need to be a society of second chances. And if no one else, like I'm in love with Xavier, y'all, if y'all can't tell by now. If we don't know that second chances work, well, you haven't met Xavier. Second chances work. And we need to be a society of second chances.
Amen, especially for those who are never going to first chance. Let me go to other folks who want to weigh in. That was great.
I'm sorry, I was chuckling because isn't everybody in love with Xavier? So the way that I always break down just sort of the answer of my personal answer to this question is to explain to like service providers very plainly that like as first responders, they're trained to approach, for example, a drowning victim from the side or behind, because drowning victims, you know, in their panic to live, if they see you, they're going to pull you underwater because they're fighting so hard to survive. It's visceral, right? And so they do whatever it takes to survive. And they aren't bad people. They don't intend to hurt you. They aren't morally depraved, but they're using like every strength that they have and all of their like caveman brain and any and all effort to pull you down to keep their head above water. And to me, it's the same for trafficking victims in terms of criminality. And so robust, lateral, safe and informed services and programs must be available for immediate response. And you guys as first responders, you wouldn't tell a drowning victim to make an appointment for rescue. You wouldn't ask a drowning victim, for example, to fill out a 20-page application prior to rescue. You wouldn't delay response to collect their demographics for funding purposes. So their need is immediate and their intervention needs to be immediate.
I just wanted to say it's interesting. First of all, thank you all for the love. And you know, I always remind myself that no matter how lovely you all speak of me, I know for a fact I'm not the exception to the rule, y'all. There are so many people, you know, in my space, and I don't mean my space as in a social media thing. I mean, in my space, right? who are just extraordinary human beings, some of the most loving, caring, compassionate people I've ever known. And many of them I grew up inside the prison system. And you know, as a co-executive director of the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, I'm also co-founder of the Incarcerated Children's Advocacy Network. And this is a national network. In order to be a member of this, and I hope none of you aspire to be a member, but by consequence of our experiences, you know, you have to have been convicted of a homicide-related offense and or sentenced to life without parole when you were a child. You have to have had a positive change. You have to have a commitment to social justice and to live out your eternal apology now that you had that second chance, or perhaps much like James said, that first chance. So then this national network is called the Incarcerated Children's Advocacy Network. There are over 200 members, the majority of whom were condemned to die in prison when they were children. We're the only country in the world that sentences children to die in prison, thanks to James' leadership and others who are advocating on these fronts across the country. And of course, that of the Coalition for the Campaign for Fair Sentencing of Children across the country. They're free now. Examples of positive change. They're feeding the homeless. They're working as substance abuse counselors. They're helping kids to stop them from committing the same mistakes. They're working in courthouses and juvenile facilities. They're going to law school. You know, Marshawn Allen just got accepted to law school. You know, I can go on and on about so many amazing people who I know.
All right.
And I want to get emotional. So I just want to say that, again, I'm not the exception to the rule, and I really hope that you all see the capacity for change and not throw them away. No child is born bad, and all children deserve a chance for positive change. Thank you.
Xavier, thank you for your heart. Thank you for your compassion. Thank you for your building of our perspectives. I think if you haven't checked it out already, he actually has a TED Talk. No child is born bad. If someone in Framework could Google that, throw it in the link, chat link, that would be amazing. But yeah, and also I think that the other thing, this change, I think that we all know that you were never bad, that no child is born bad. So even though we talk about change, circumstances make things and decisions and situations very difficult, and hopefully all providers on this call will walk away with that message today. We have a lot of questions that I've tried to go through. I'm going to grab this one really quickly. Lale asked, what sort of training around forced criminality do you suggest? I'm going to let all the audience members know that we are going to send out a follow-up, and all resources that the panelists suggest and want you to walk away with will be included. And the other thing is, if you have not had this training in your area, then partner, connect, see how you can build it. Contact these amazing panelists and experts and have them help you build it. Pay them to do so. So we will be sharing some of those things in the follow-up. And a lot of the questions were related to legal remedies and relief opportunities. I am going to get to what organizations can do as far as following advantageous policies and legal relief opportunities that are out there in states right now. But first, I want to ask, what if survivors don't believe in those legal reliefs? What if they don't think that maybe that they are going to be successful in going through the process? They're not worthy. They still have placed some of that blame inside of themselves. Any advice that our providers can pass on, and for those survivors that are actually on this call?
I would say definitely connect them with other survivors. I have met survivors who don't feel that they're worthy or don't see themselves as a survivor, or ask all these questions as when they look back at their victimization. And I think what's really powerful is connecting them with other survivors to say, listen, I hear you. I too was in a situation like you. I too was charged for crimes I was forced to commit, and helping them to see that there is light, helping them to see that they're valuable. Because oftentimes when you escape trafficking and people think, hey, the person escaped, right? They are no longer in trafficking. Yay, hallelujah, we're good. But that is where the true work begins, for helping people to see or unpack the things where the trafficker told them that they were, right? Like, can't turn a hoe into a housewife. I remember that's one of the lies I had to unpack, right? I called off an engagement because I still believe that lie, right? But really helping survivors to see that they're human beings. You're worthy of love. You're valuable, right? And really begin at that core, because the victimization is a thing that if I'm not believing that I'm worthy, I'm valuable, I'm worthy of love, I can't even begin to talk about the victimization. So we have to start at that core and working with that individual to help them to get to see themselves of who they truly are. And that takes work. It's hard. I've been up at 1, 2 o'clock at night talking to survivors, and I'm just like, sweetheart, let's talk about this. And I need you to see this and look at all your accomplishments. And even with all the things that they have done, it's still so hard for them to embrace this other side outside of trafficking because of the lies that they've been brainwashed to believe about themselves.
Any other things before we go? James?
I was just going to jump. One thing that I think is really important for people to keep in mind as well is that, you know, every survivor is very different, both in terms of where they're at in their healing journey, the sorts of associations they make. I know some survivors who, you know, they feel more at home and more comfortable with the community of formerly incarcerated folks than they do like in the anti-trafficking space. And so this is where intersectionality, I think, is really, really important, right? Because if you have a survivor who's been incarcerated for decades on end, right, they've grown up in the system that like they associate a lot more of their experiences oftentimes with that sort of background. And so having sort of those connections, like I think, Charlie, to your point, like in different circles that you can connect people with where they can have that sense of shared experiences is really, really helpful, right? So everyone's different, everyone comes from a different perspective, and just keeping that in mind when you're working with folks to understand that, you know, we're all different, and you know, making sure that there's a variety of different options available for survivors, I think is really critical.
Charlie, were you going to go back to that question about legislation?
Yeah, so we are going to answer a very robust question that was upvoted by a lot of individuals. How do you deal with federal charges for which there are no post-conviction relief, and where prosecutors and law enforcement aren't recognizing these things as a form of human trafficking?
Well, I love to promote this group, Jessica Emerson and Kate. James, help me pronounce Kate's last name because I can never pronounce.
I'm going to butcher it too. It's Morgalescu. Yeah, she's at Brooklyn Law School.
Right. So they run the Survivor Reentry Project. And I want to say, while we are talking about survivors who have been forced to commit crimes, and a lot of these come through at a state level, we have 46 states that have vacatur laws, right? And these 46 states, not all of these states have a comprehensive vacatur law, right? Most of these states, their vacatur law is only pertaining to prostitution. So if I was forced to commit another crime outside of prostitution, and that's like that vacatur law wouldn't help. right? And so those are your survivors who have state level charges. On a federal level, there's no criminal relief. Since 2016, we have been trying to introduce legislation on a federal level, and it's stalled. Senator Gillibrand out of New York introduced legislation, and there is no movement on a federal level. The only remedy that's available for survivors who have been charged on a federal level is a presidential pardon. I was a part of the group that I withdraw my application. I came through the last time, just all I had to do was to put my application in an envelope. I did everything and I said, no, I am not going to apply for a federal pardon, because that means that I am saying to the system, I apologize for what I did. I was the perpetrator. That's not the message that I'm going to fight for. I'm going to fight so that this system understand victims are victims are victims. They're not perpetrator. So I withdrew my application because I can't be talking to survivors and saying to them, you are not a perpetrator, you're a victim, but I'm putting in a presidential pardon to say, hey, I know I'm a perpetrator, please forgive me. So I withdrew my application. And of all the survivors that I knew that submitted applications for presidential pardons, only one received a presidential pardon. And the process that she went through, some of the questions that came back, did you ever enjoy having sex with the buyers? That was one of the questions. So when you're talking about even going through that process of applying for a presidential pardon, the triggers and how traumatic that can be, because these are the same individuals who are not even seeing and understanding the complexity of trafficking. So we need to fight harder. We need to truly fight harder, get our legislators to understand that we need more comprehensive laws, and the rule of law is just not enough. So even before survivors get these charges, bring in expert witnesses. I'm a part of the Just Exit Council with Equitas, and that's what we work with prosecutors to say, bring in survivors as expert witnesses on your cases so that these survivors don't end up with a criminal charge in the first place. Yeah. So there would no need to be for vacatur laws that are, I can't say they're not working, because we do have survivors who are benefiting from them. I do have survivor friends who have benefited from them. I see one of them on this webinar right now that have benefited from, and I'm celebrating with that individual. However, we can't ignore a particular set. We need a federal vacatur law.
If we were to reach a place in our society where those who commit crimes or are forced to commit crimes are seen as victims, I cannot imagine what our system would look like. And I got a glimpse of this in 2016. I had shared my story in a WGN report. I live in Chicago, by the way, and everybody watches WGN, and I was like, oh no, people are gonna see me, I'm gonna be embarrassed, they're gonna be reaching out, and I was like bracing the seat, and I remember it was tasteful, it was respectful, it allowed me to share my story, what happened with Pedro, who was the victim of my case, and I shared details about my case that I had never shared before. And 2 weeks later, I got an email from a woman named Cynthia Alonso, and that email, the first sentence said, hi, I'm Cynthia, and I am one of the sisters of Pedro Martinez. It's the victim of my case. And of course, I was terrified of the thought of having to communicate at all with this family, knowing the details of the case, knowing that the system had never allowed that in the first place. It wasn't designed for that. I never thought I would ever have to be faced with that. And the next sentence said, we've been following you, and we like what you've done with your life. We're wondering if you'd be willing to meet with us and talk to us and let us know what happened on that October night. As much as I didn't want to believe that was Pedro's sister, the fact that she said October night, I knew for a fact that was Pedro's sister. I shared this because the system didn't reinforce that communication. It didn't allow that to happen, and I didn't know how to handle it. I went to, if you need a doctor, you go to a doctor. You need a mechanic, you go to the auto shop, right? Well, I went to Father Kelly, right? Father Kelly, he's someone who I've known many years, and he works in restorative justice. And he said, Xavier, I know you're scared and you're nervous, but maybe this is what God wants you to do. And I was like, well, I'm not turning away from that. I just don't know how to do this. I don't know what to say. What do you say to people you've harmed so badly, And I remember him saying, if you want, I'll talk with Cynthia. And I said, no, let me call first. That's the right thing to do. So I did call, and we talked for hours, and she asked questions, and she still wanted her family to meet me. And she was hesitant to say much, but was really just trying to get a sense of who I really was in light of all that, my involvement in that case, and had a lot of questions. Long story short, 2 weeks later, I ended up going to Precious Blood Ministries there on the south side of Chicago, backyards where I grew up, the same neighborhood, just a block and a half away from where it happened. And Father Kelly welcomed their family there. And I was at the bottom steps, hesitant to go up, scared once again, walking into this, what I thought would be a dangerous situation. And I remember walking into the space and not knowing, whether to make eye contact, whether to smile, do I shake their hand? What do I do when I walk into the room? I was scared, I was prayerful leading up to it. And I remember Father Kelly recognizing that something, he saw how uncomfortable it was. He pulled us into the circle room. And along with myself and his family were other advocates and people who had lost loved ones to violence, who believed in restorative justice, who were there to support me and his family. And I remember how tearful and how shameful I felt to hear about all the harm that they experienced, all the sadness, how it impacted not just them, but it impacted their children, the generations, the ripples of harm that spanned the generations of their lives. And I was just there, and though I was well accomplished, and though I had a degree, and I had all these wonderful things to say about myself, I didn't share none of it because I became that 13-year-old again. I became that 13-year-old crumbled up on my mother's couch, asking God to forgive me. And I remember barely able to come out of my arms to make eye contact and feeling so ashamed. One of the brothers had walked over and he put his arm on my shoulder and he said, if you don't want to talk about what happened tonight, you don't have to. He said, that's not what we're here for. And it was then that it dawned on me that it wasn't just about me. I realized it was about a family that needed to heal, that had questions. And then when I shared about my life and who I was and what led up to that day and what happened on that day, unexpectedly, the older brother, Gerard, he was the first one to say that he forgave me. And the reason why he forgave me, I'll never forget, and it resonates much with what we're talking about here. He said, Xavier, we forgive you because you were a victim too. We realized that you were a victim too. And even in that moment, it was hard for me to embrace that because I never allowed myself to think that way, feeling guilty and ashamed of what I had done. And so I just want to end my piece there and say, if a family who I've harmed so badly and have all the reasons in the world to hate me, to ridicule me, but instead brought bags of food, literally brought bags of food because they had been up all night cooking some of Pedro's favorite foods. If they had the compassion to forgive me, to see me as a victim, to see the beautiful outcome of a life changed, and more importantly, reinforcing that with forgiveness and encouragement to help kids in the community and fight for second chances. I don't know what that could look like systemically. I don't know what that looks like, right? I don't know what that looks like. I know it'll be beautiful. I know it'll be in tune with our real humanity. It'll resonate with what parents want for their kids, So I'll just leave it there.
Xavier, you are so powerful in your vulnerability and your authenticity. Thank you for sharing that power with us, because I feel like I know that I have grown in this past hour and a half. I know that our audience members have grown and that they are walking away with hopefully a change of heart and mind, as well as some actionable items. Learning that we need to do more partnering with law enforcement. We need to build awareness. We need to partner with the individuals who are in charge of policy making, even if that's not what our organization does. They should be hearing from the people who are working with the survivors. They should be hearing from the people who are learning from today. So see what you can do within your community. Reach out to these individuals. We will share their contact information, their resources, their referrals with our follow-up. And also make sure that your organization is able to employ these amazing panelists, because otherwise, whose voices are you missing? And you have to consider that. You have to look in-house, not just at all these other levels. So we will be sharing a wealth of information with you, but unfortunately, we are 5 minutes over. Thank you, Shamere, Autumn, Xavier, Carolina, James. You were fantastic. And I know that everyone in the chat is just sending accolades all of your way. We will share those with you as well.